Massachusetts' 7th Congressional District, and Representative Justin Amash from Michigan's 3rd Congressional District, as well as the director of the MacArthur Justice Center's DC office, Amir Ali. Today, we'll be talking about ending qualified immunity for police officers. We were all horrified watching a white police officer kneel on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, murdering him. Some elected officials have suggested tactical changes for police, such as banning chokeholds, as a way to prevent the murder of Black people. Yet, 1 in 1,000 Black men can expect to be killed by the police in the United States. Black people in the United States are killed every week. Police kill over 1,000 civilians a year and only rarely face consequences or accountability. Under the qualified immunity doctrine, public officials, including law enforcement who engage in misconduct and even violate a person's constitutional rights, are protected from liability, as the Supreme Court says, except for all but the plainly incompetent or those who knowingly violate the law. However, even law enforcement who violate a person's rights maliciously are immune from accountability unless the victim can show the officer violated clearly established law. The Supreme Court has held that in order to do that, a victim of police brutality seeking justice must be able to point to an already decided case involving the same specific context and particular conduct. Essentially, police must know that they are doing something wrong or be so incompetent as to make no difference. And the victim must be able to point to a judicial decision that it happened to involve the same context and conduct in order for the court to hold them accountable for brutality, including killings. As protests continue in the wake of the killings of Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Rayshard Brooks, and too many others, there's emerging bipartisan support for ending the doctrine of qualified immunity for police. Representatives Ayanna Pressley and Justin Amash have proposed a bill that would do just that. The Ending Qualified Immunity Act would allow courts to more readily hold police accountable for horrific rights abuses. Thank you again for joining us. Before we dive into the bill's details, it's worth pointing out that this is not exactly an expected pairing. Ayanna, you are known as a progressive member of the squad. Justin, you were a Tea Party conservative before breaking from Republicans over the impeachment of President Trump. What brought you both together? Go ahead, Ayanna.
Okay, I'll start that. Yeah, listen, we may not agree on everything that government should do or provide, but we are really clear on what it shouldn't. Mass surveillance, including deployment of invasive technology like facial recognition, mandatory minimums, civil asset forfeiture, endless drug wars, and obviously qualified immunity are just a few areas that require reform, if not outright elimination. And it might surprise some folks, this actually isn't the first time that we've partnered on something. This is the second time. Representative Amash was an original sponsor of my bill to abolish the federal death penalty and has remained a steadfast advocate and partner for its passage. So this is what we do.
That's what we do. Amazing. Justin, you want to add anything to that? Justin, you there?
Did we lose him?
I think he might be frozen.
Oh.
We'll come back. I think it's great. One thing about qualified immunity, Justice Sotomayor has recently said that it renders the protections of the Fourth Amendment hollow. So whether you're conservative or progressive, if you value the Constitution and protecting Fourth Amendment rights, I think it seems like a no-brainer. Representative Pressley, you've said there's no justice without healing and accountability. How has qualified immunity prevented healing and accountability for police? And why is ending qualified immunity so important to the civil rights moment we're in right now?
Yeah, well, this is a tipping point. There's a reckoning, in the streets and an uprising. And, I maintain there will be unrest in our streets for as long as there is unrest in our lives. And this is a corrosive, systemic problem. The only thing COVID-19 could not kill is racism. And so although the tipping point has been the most recent murders of unarmed Black folks, of course, we know what we see in the streets is about everything. But at the end of the day, if we believe that Black lives matter, then justice for the Black lives that we have been robbed of matters. And true justice would be all of these people, and we'll say their names as often as we can, although it is dizzying and traumatic, and we are drowning in an abyss of loss just trying to keep up. But Tony McDade and George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, real justice would be that they would still be alive. So there can never be true justice, but what there must be is accountability. And ending qualified immunity gets us closer to that. And that accountability does get us to healing. Now, just to go back to the historical context of this, the right to sue state and local officials, including police, is a Reconstruction era law. It was passed to protect Black folks in the South who were experiencing significant backlash to the rights recently established in the 14th Amendment. Now, the legislation established this right. The Civil Rights Act of 1871 was also known as the Ku Klux Klan Act. So these protections were a direct response to rampant white supremacist violence against Black people simply existing and exercising their rights. So eliminating qualified immunity is important now, but it's important to every moment where Black folks feel the law's punishment before they ever do its protection. So, if you have when you have officers operating with callous disregard for human life, for Black lives, egregious misconduct, brutality, murder, operating with great impunity, without any retribution, without any consequence, without any justice. Now, is it encouraging when a police chief resigns or an officer is fired? Yes, but that still is injustice because no one is above the law, including law enforcement, and they should be prosecuted.
Yeah, thank you for breaking down the history and also reminding us how real this is for people on a daily basis. Every day we have conversations with folks and they're like, we hear about the most egregious cases, but what about all the violations that happen on a daily basis that we never hear about? So I'd like you, if possible, to let us know, like what if anything, do you think ending qualified immunity will change and getting us closer to justice? So how would this impact daily activity of police? And sorry, I ask questions like a prosecutor.
Sure. Well, again, this is pervasive, it is systemic, and systemic problems require systemic solutions. Probably for folks that don't get what's happening, the closest example that I could offer is, what happened in the Catholic Church. It wouldn't be fair to say that those were just a couple of, bad apples. It was ingrained, it was systemic within the culture. The priests were just being rotated, from parish to parish, and engaging in predatory abusive behavior. And so, James Baldwin reminds us that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And so we have to face this, confront this. And if you want culture change, if you want system change, then there have to be consequences. What's the deterrent? I wish that everyone was just motivated by sheer benevolence. But again, this is systemic, it is pervasive. It is a culture of impunity among police. So eliminating it would put an end to that culture. In any other job in America, there are standards of conduct and consequences for violating them. Doctors can be sued for malpractice, lawyers for negligence, and so on. So policing should be no exception. Again, no one is above the law, including law enforcement. So if you know there will be material consequences, how likely are you to harass a group of Black kids, conduct an illegal search, put your knee to someone's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds? So many refer to America as a nation of laws, but until those enforcing the law believe and behave and conduct themselves as if it applies to them, that simply can't be true.
I think most would agree that police shouldn't be above the law, and that's conservatives and progressives alike. I'm not going to touch the Catholic Church. You ain't going to have the Pope mad at me. I see Justin is back.
You understand what I'm trying to get at. The point
No,
is,
totally.
That's the counter, the argument that we're just talking about a few sort of quote unquote bad apples and rogue cops. We have to root out this problem according to just how corrosive, pervasive, and systemic it is.
Absolutely. Justin, I'd like to bring you in. I know we lost you for a
little while. Sorry.
No problem. We were talking about disqualified immunity, what it means to the daily practices of police, what impact, if any, that it would have. I'd like to see if you can answer, how has the understanding of qualified immunity evolved in conservative spaces, and how do you see it developing as you discuss this bill?
Yeah, first I want to say, because I think I got cut off earlier, my internet went out at the wrong time, but I want to say that it's been an honor working with Ayanna on this. And we've worked together on other things. We have a lot of issues in common. We disagree on other issues, but that's okay. I think the important thing is where we find common ground, we work together. And that's what's wonderful about working with Ayanna and a number of Democrats. I'm a libertarian, but I'm happy to work with anyone on the right or the left if we've got issues in common. And this is a huge issue here. Not just this part of criminal justice reform, but all of criminal justice reform is hugely important. So I would say that on the right, there is support for ending qualified immunity. I mean, when you look at what the Supreme Court has been doing, they've been rejecting these cases. They haven't been taking them up, but you've seen Clarence Thomas speak out against qualified immunity as it currently exists. Now, I'm not sure what kind of system he would prefer, but he does believe that it should go back to Congress to decide this thing, that it shouldn't be a doctrine that has developed through the Supreme Court in a way that protects police officers inconsistent with the law and inconsistent with the Constitution. So there are people on the right who support ending qualified immunity. We do have a Republican co-sponsor on the legislation as well. And I believe there will be Republicans in the Senate who support ending qualified immunity. I suspect that there will be a bill that moves through the Senate as well with some Republican support. So the question is whether we can make it a mainstream thing on the right. The hard part about it right now is that you have the president pushing back so aggressively against ending qualified immunity. You had the press secretary saying really absurd things yesterday about how no one will want to be a police officer if they don't have qualified immunity, which is insane because qualified immunity only protects you if you have violated the law. So if you don't violate the law, you don't have anything to worry about in this case. And there are underlying Supreme Court doctrines related to the Fourth Amendment and Fifth Amendment and First Amendment that already protect police officers in split-second decision-making. So there's not a real reason to layer this on top of those other protections. So I think we can make headway on the right. People on the right also don't like the idea of the judicial branch legislating. And this is a type of judicial branch legislating. This underlying law was passed in 1871, and then the Supreme Court came in almost 100 years later and said, hey, let's start to tinker with this law and change the way it's interpreted. So I think there is room on the right for support.
Thank you for mentioning the Senate. So, South Carolina Senator Tim Scott and Republican Majority Leader Mitch McConnell just proposed a police reform bill that would incentivize police departments to stop using chokeholds, though it would not ban them from doing so. The bill notably does not include an end to qualified immunity. What is the appetite of Republican leadership, including Mitch McConnell? You mentioned President Trump, but where does McConnell stand on this? And how do we get past this so-called poison pill? I've heard mention of poison pills.
Yeah,
it's the antidote.
So it's hard to know what is going on in Mitch McConnell's head right now. It's hard to know, generally speaking, but I would say that there's a possibility for this kind of reform to go forward if you don't have a lot of interference from the White House and a lot of interference from people on the right who are sometimes just pro police in all circumstances, regardless of the circumstance. And if you don't have that kind of thing happening on the right, then you can make some headway. It's really about a conflict of interests here, whether people are willing to listen to their constitutional instincts, which say this is wrong, this is government abuse. Many people on the right, they're worried about big government. They want government to be limited. They want to protect individual rights. Whether they listen to that or whether they're more concerned about groups that they represent, like police unions and others, who are upset about it, but sometimes upset, I think, for the wrong reasons. I think that there's not enough understanding of how qualified immunity works and how it might benefit police officers actually to have qualified immunity ended, because if you end it, then the public perception of the police community relationship can improve. And I think that's really important. I think that you need to have a better relationship between the police and the community that they serve. And you can't have that when you have these egregious cases out there where someone is trying to receive compensation for misconduct from a police officer and they can't receive compensation. That then permeates throughout society, and everyone starts to lose faith in the justice system. They lose faith in policing. And I think that is harmful to our justice system in a major way. So police officers should care about this, about ending qualified immunity, and Mitch McConnell should care about it, because I think it is better for Republicans, it's better for conservatives, and it's better for our society, of course.
From a communication standpoint, is there any messaging that's been particularly helpful or impactful for you in terms of communicating with your Republican colleagues?
I think when it comes to Republicans, they're more persuaded by some of the constitutional arguments with respect to the Supreme Court legislating from the bench. They're persuaded by the idea of protecting individual rights. If this is perceived as something that is anti-police, then it is harmful. But I don't think it's anti-police. I think it's pro-police. It's pro-good policing. You want good police out there who are doing the right thing to not be tarnished by everyone else. So if people on the right say it's bad apples, and we all have concerns about that framing, about being just bad apples. But if people on the right want to say it's just bad apples, then let's deal with bad apples. Let's deal with the people who are doing the wrong thing. This is one way to do it. It's a pretty simple way to do it. And it's not going to be the fix for everything, but it's an important step, and it creates a better relationship with the communities they serve.
Yeah, and especially with respect to the bad apples, I keep hearing that, and I thought there's a good response, which is we keep talking about bad apples, but nobody finishes the phrase, which is it's
right.
The whole bunch. We're talking about systems here. I'd like to bring in Amir. Amir, thanks for joining us. I'd like to get your thoughts. I didn't struggle to understand why we have qualified immunity in law school, and I'm hoping you could break some of this down. Can you describe some of the police conduct involving qualified immunity that you've encountered in the course of your litigation?
Yeah, of course. So look, we're all familiar at this point with Officer Derek Chauvin pressing his knee into the neck of George Floyd. We've all seen the video, the images. And look, we can and should be shocked by that video, but we can't afford to be surprised by it. And I could tell you stories that I've encountered that involve unjustified bullets, unjustified tasers, unjustified batons, chokeholds. But just to give you a sense of how much it's kind of tragic to just even say this, but how much choice I have in picking and choosing stories. Let me just zero in on the precursors to George Floyd, using the force we're talking about in that case. So let me take you back 12 years, a man named Ronnie Wilson. His family calls 911 to report that Mr. Wilson's having a mental breakdown. Florida law told his family to call 911 to report a mental breakdown. That's what you're supposed to do. When the officers arrive, Mr. Wilson is sitting in his car. He's doing nothing violent. They tase him 8 times to get him out of the car. And Mr. Wilson's life ends on his family's driveway with an officer pressing a knee into his back. In George Floyd's case, we'll all remember the words, "I can't breathe." For Ronnie Wilson, the words came from his mother, who watched the police kill her son. and said, "They just killed my son. We did not mean for you to come here and kill him." Another example, Kari Illage, 2013, young man walking next to the road. He's unarmed. He's in fact naked, having a reaction to drugs. Someone calls 911, reporting it as a trespass, that this young black man is walking along this, tree-lined road. Police show up. They tase him several times. He's on the floor. He's on the ground, face down. They tase him another 14 times. And then a 385-pound officer presses his knee into his back, and he dies. Just give you one quick additional example. Norman Cooper, my colleague Emily Clark, has written about Mr. Cooper's case. Brother calls 911 because Mr. Cooper is having a reaction to drugs. Police show up. If it sounds like I'm a broken record here, it's because the record is very broken. Ends with a knee in the back of Mr. Cooper, taking his life in his own family home. So there are many more I could give you, and these people all had one thing in common, in addition to the fact that they died with a knee to their backside, an officer's knee to their backside. Their families all tried to hold the officers involved accountable. Every one of them was kicked out of court on qualified immunity. The judges did not say what happened here was consistent with the Constitution. They did not say that any reasonable officer would have done the same thing that these officers did. They said it doesn't matter whether what they did violated the Constitution. These officers are immune anyways.
Why didn't it matter? Can you break that down for folks who are really trying to understand qualified immunity? To the judges, well, first, to the people that hear these stories, people think, how could this be? How could this happen? What was the judge's reasoning in these cases? Briefly, if you could describe what the real problem is here.
Right. So you said eloquently at the front, and Justin mentioned it too. And let me just kind of break this down. When you bring a lawsuit against anyone, police officer, doctor, engineer, you've got to show they violated the law. And here that involves showing that a reasonable officer would not have used force in the circumstances. With or without qualified immunity, someone's going to have to show that the officer did something that wasn't just a reasonable mistake. So if anyone's telling you qualified immunity is about mistakes, they're lying to you. What the court has said is, even if you show that an officer's conduct was so unreasonable that it violates the Constitution, we're going to give that officer who engaged in that unconstitutional misconduct immunity from any sort of liability, from a lawsuit against him, unless you can find a case that happens to look like this case. And it has to be a very particular case that came from a court above us, and it has to look very similar. So what happens is, quite literally, officers are coming into court. This is a real example. It's true I sicked an officer, even if I sicked, an attack dog on this individual who was not doing anything threatening to me. In this case, he was surrendering with his arms up. In the other case that the victim's family is citing, the officer was face down on the floor. So I should be immune, even though my use of force that badly injured this person really, even if it couldn't be justified. And that's what we're seeing, is these absurd arguments that say, well, there's this tiny, that decision happened on a Tuesday, my case happened on a Wednesday. We're pretty much down to that level of specificity. And this is why officers like Derek Chauvin can look into a camera as they are being videotaped and think they're going to get away with it, because courts have told them they will get away with it.
Yeah. Thank you for breaking that down and for noting in every case what happened when people called 911, because I speak to people every day and they say straight up, like, I don't dial 911 anymore for emergencies because they're afraid of what will happen if the police come to their homes. And I think that's something that is often overlooked and directly related to what Justin was saying about this idea of legitimacy and who these institutions are supposed to serve. So, you've been having these conversations with a lot of elected officials for some time. What does the political evolution look like on this issue?
Well, there was a time not so long ago when people would reach out to me and say, what can we do about this? And it was hard to come up with an answer because we were fighting in the Supreme Court. We were waiting for the court to do something. And it was it's not just Ayanna and Justin who are working together with others across the ideological spectrum. I mean, advocacy groups, you have social justice groups like my own, the MacArthur Justice Center, NAACP, Legal Defense Fund, partnering with libertarian groups and groups on the right. And we've been doing that for a long time. Now there's extra excitement here because we have the Ayannas and the Justins who are in Congress talking about this. And so this moment is one we have to seize on. We can't wait for the Supreme Court.
Thanks, Amir. I think there's a lot of public education that needs to continue to happen. So really appreciate your leadership on this issue, and Darshak was super excited about this. This question is for each of you. What are the next steps in turning this bill into law? Starting with you, Ayanna.
Yeah, well, I just want to, first, I appreciate just all of you so very much. And when you speak about the evolution of this debate and on this issue, you just have to give it up to the activists and the advocates and the surviving family members who've been robbed of their loved ones, who have remained vigilant in their advocacy. And for that reason, we are seeing change. And I continue to encourage people, continue to organize, mobilize, protest, demonstrate. Black Lives Matter. There's a culture shift occurring, but now we need to see a power shift, and that is about law shift, and that is about budget shift. And to Justin's point, specifically around what has been most effective with Republican colleagues, if they don't want to see that legislating from the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court decision to not take up qualified immunity earlier this week makes it clear that Congress must act. And again, taking this back to the streets and the power of movements, those that are out in the streets are demanding that Congress act. They are demanding that we function as the conscience of this nation. And that is across every ideological spectrum, or we would not see the streets teeming with people and these multi-generational, multiracial movements, and folks continue to be in the streets. So, I mean, what were the freedom rides? I don't know, 700 and maybe 3 months. Montgomery was maybe 392 days. We're like 20 days in, And so with over 60 co-sponsors and endorsements from countless organizations, such as the ACLU, the Leadership Conference, and the National Urban League, I'm feeling very encouraged. And in fact, our bill is the first tripartisan bill in the history of Congress, because we do have Republican support, So I'm grateful to Justin for his solidarity, on this and so many issues in this space. The momentum is here. So this is really just about continued education and pressure on leadership to take up the bill. And in fact, doing so is being responsive to the unrest that is all around us. This is what all of our constituents are demanding that we do, and that is to lead and to do it boldly.
Absolutely. Justin? I think you're muted. Justin, you're muted.
Yeah. So I was saying it's hard to add to that because Ayanna basically said it perfectly. I mean, it was spot on. We need to keep reaching out to people on the right, keep making the case. A lot of them are not really that informed about qualified immunity. For some people, it's the first time they're hearing about it. So it's a matter of educating them about how it works, about the Supreme Court doctrine, about Congress's role. I think those are important things that can persuade people on the right. When they find out about Clarence Thomas's concerns about it, that moves people, actually. I'm sure there are other conservative scholars out there who can help move people on the right. So I think that's important. But I've been talking to a lot of people. I spoke to Breonna Taylor's family yesterday. And I think it's so critical that we keep our voices heard, that we keep going out and protesting and speaking out in the streets. I think that's very important that our voices be heard, because that helps move people in Congress. If you don't have the public pushing, then you won't get movement in Congress. I tell people at home this all the time. We can work really hard to try to convince our colleagues, but you know who really convinces our colleagues? People at home. If people at home speak out, if they demonstrate, if they rally, and they do all those things to put pressure on Congress, then you can get some real movement.
Thank you, Justin. Amir, do you have any final comments or any resources for folks?
I'll give you 3 quick things you can do. First, explain it to people. If you're on this call, if you're listening to this and watching this, you're part of the movement, whether you like it or not. Go tell 3 people what qualified immunity is. You saw John do it at the top of the hour on this. Very succinct. When people understand it, they're as troubled as all of us are about this. Second, the bill itself is what our president would call beautiful. And I think at some point he will call it a beautiful bill. Call your member of Congress. It's 4 pages long. You can read it. I'm sure it was an immense amount of work to do this so clearly, but in unqualified languages, in really 2 sentences, Ayanna and Justin have put together language that would end qualified immunity, and you need to call your representative. And let me just add a third one, because I feel like this is not said nearly enough, and that's that it takes really 3 to tango on this. There's the victim's family who tries to hold the officer accountable. There is the law and the judge applying the law. But in every one of these cases, there's a government lawyer, or at least a lawyer who's representing government officials, who has to invoke this doctrine. So bring it local. I'm involved in a case against the NYPD where their argument is that they get qualified immunity even though the jury found that they tased someone who was already incapacitated. So Mayor Bill de Blasio needs calls and needs to be called out for his government lawyers, and they are lawyers for the city of New York arguing qualified immunity. Find out who in your municipality is in charge of those decisions. And when you're making the call to your Congress people, make a call there and call them out too.
Thank you all so much for your time and your leadership on this issue. We really appreciate it. This is urgent, right? We need action now, and the world is watching. So appreciate it. Tomorrow, we'll be taking a moment to celebrate Juneteenth and reimagine freedom for Black people in the United States. But the briefing will be back on Monday to discuss today's Supreme Court's DACA decision. So thank you, and stay safe out there.